Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
We are doing a series on abortion, and we wanted to take a step back and look at what the Quran says about the soul. And we've looked at the hadith last time, and now it's time to look at the Quran and see, when does a person develop and when does the soul develop? Where does the soul come from? There are all these questions about the soul. It's kind of mysterious. So I thought maybe it was worth discussing, Dr. Shabir.
Yeah,
and it's important for our discussion about abortion because people think that once the soul enters into the embryo or fetus, then at that point, abortion is not allowed except for very particular circumstances. Like, for example, if the mother's life is in danger, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's important to know when the soul enters the body of the fetus. By the way, this would be a good point at which I should give credit to people who I've benefited from in my research for this. In fact, just on my way into the studio, I was listening to Sheikh Yasser Qadi and his discussion on the soul and relevant verses of the Quran and so on. But I've also listened to a discussion of him together with Hatim al-Hajj, who is with the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America, he himself being a medical doctor and also a Muslim jurist, bridging the two streams of knowledge. That was a very important discussion. And also Sheikh Omar Sulaiman in a separate discussion of the question of abortion. So having given that credit to where it is due, and my thanks to all of those whose books I've read and so on, too many to mention.
I know you've been counseling people for a few months, I believe, on this subject. And so I guess you've learned a lot in the process, right?
Yes.
From the people you've counseled, from scholars, from other people that you've tried to look up as well.
That's right. Now, coming back to the Quran on the question of the soul. So the Quran does not tell us when the soul is breathed into the body, except in the case of Adam. The Quran says, and even then too, one needs to interpret to see what the verses literally say, and then what we interpret it to mean. So basically, we can find, for example, in the 15th chapter of the Quran, the 7th chapter of the Quran, God creating Adam and God saying to the angels, فَإِذَا سَوَيْتُهُ وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, when I have shaped him and then blown into him of my spirit, فَقَعُوا لَهُ سَاجِدِينَ, then you are to all show obeisance to him. So this might be interpreted and has been interpreted by classical commentators in a very literalistic way, following from descriptions also in the Bible already before the Quran. And they take it that God literally took dirt and made a kind of figure as a lifeless object shaped out of mud, and then blew the soul into the body, and then the body became alive, and so on. But all of that is not in the Quran. And in our discussion on the question of evolution, we have taken a non-literal approach to these passages. But nonetheless, one can say that this is a mention of the soul being blown into the body of Adam. But in terms of being blown into the body of the fetus, we have the hadith that we discussed previously, but we don't have anything similar in the Quran that the soul is blown into the mother's tummy at a certain time. In the case of Jesus, the mention of Mary becoming pregnant is accompanied with the saying that God breathed into her womb. Mm-hmm. And for this reason, Muslims are quite comfortable in referring to Jesus as the Spirit of God, because they think that we believe that God blew something of his Spirit into the body of Mary, as a result of which Jesus was born. Mm-hmm. But Muslim theology adds that that's in the case of all of us. And of course, we know that from the hadith that this is done. But it's not mentioned in the Quran in the case of all individuals.
So is the soul what makes someone a person? Like, what is the soul?
Yeah, so the Quran does not go into much detail about this. The Quran says, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ, they ask you about the spirit. قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي, say the spirit is by the command of my Lord. Or is of the matters of my Lord, like their matters about God, or their matters that belong to God.
Much about.
Like, وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. You took the words out of my mouth. the Quran says, you have not been given of knowledge of it except a little. So it's a little bit of knowledge that we have. The Quran also mentions that when we die, the souls are taken. And when we sleep, the souls are taken. This is mentioned in the 6th chapter of the Quran and also in the 39th chapter. For example, in the verse that says, Allah yatawaffa al-anfusa hina mawtiha wallati lam tamut fi manamiha. God is the one who takes the souls that die, and then those that do not die, but in their sleep. And then, as for those for whose death God has decreed, He keeps the souls. But in the case of those for whose time of death is not yet, God returns the soul to them. So we get the impression from this that the soul is taken away at sleep. Some people die during that sleep, and their souls are kept by God. Some people are awakened, and they're there with their souls. But is it the soul that animates the human body? Now, that's the idea we get from the Bible. God breathed into Adam, and Adam became a living soul. So there is some equation here, if the blowing of the Spirit and the life itself, or some close connection, if not equation. But some people simplistically make that into an equation in Islamic terms as well. So they would think that, okay, so the person is dying, and what's happening here? The soul is being taken away from the body. And that causes the death of the person, they think. And in a similar way, at the beginning of life, they're thinking, oh, so the soul is breathed into the body of the fetus, and that causes the fetus to come alive. And that's why the mother starts to experience movement and, some kicks from within the tummy and so on. Pleasant for the mother. So they think that the soul gives life to this dead flesh, and then eventually is taken away and the flesh becomes dead again, which is not necessarily what the Quran is saying. There could be some close association, but not necessarily equivalence between the breathing of the soul or taking of the soul and the initiation of life and the cause of death.
So the Quran doesn't tell us when the soul emerges then?
No, the Quran does not say that it is done at a specific point in the case of all human babies. And even the blowing, in the case of Adam, we have leaned towards a metaphorical type of interpretation, an interpretation that might say, look, this is what people could have understood at the time. And rather than the Quran going into a long explanation of what is meant by the soul, the Quran draws the lessons from what people can be reminded of based on their background knowledge already. The soul is like this, okay? So what does that mean for you? And what does that mean for your relationship with God? What should you do now? Rather than go into the whole philosophical discussion about what the soul is. But as we get into this abortion question, it behooves us to understand a little bit more about whether the soul is actually blown in at a particular time, and if so, at what time, or whether the soul is more a kind of an emergent property, just like the human consciousness, or maybe the soul is actually the human consciousness that actually develops with the fetus as the fetus is developing, and the brain of the fetus develops more and more, and becomes more and more a human being, and therefore more and more with the sort of consciousness that we associate with human beings in contradistinction to the animals around us.
Thank you for that, Dr. Shabir. We'll continue our discussion next time.
Sure, you're welcome. Our videos reach people all over the world. We hope you will seize the opportunity to share in the reward from God. Please support us today.